back in your chair, relax, get comfortable, maybe close your eyes if you wish, and take a short imaginary trip with me. I'm going to start by imagining that we're sitting in a warm, sun-filled meadow. Feel the breeze and the sunshine, sitting comfortably and looking up into the branches of a large apple tree. The tree has a stout, thick trunk and smooth gray bark, wide spreading branches, but because it's January, the tree is quiet and still right now. The branches are bare of any leaves, and we can see them silhouetted against the sky. Now, in our imaginary journey, let's move the calendar forward gently to March. Our apple tree still looks quiet and still. The branches are bare, but if we really look closely, we can see, or maybe even feel it beginning to stir. There's a slight hum as a flow of water and sugar and nutrients begins surging from the tree's roots up its trunk and into its branches. The tree almost seems to swell, and as the calendar moves through April and May, we watch as the fat brown buds on our apple tree's branches fling off their brown winter coats. Lovely pink and white blossoms appear, and tiny, bright spring green leaves. And suddenly, our apple tree that a month ago was quiet and still is now a very busy place. Bumblebees hum among the blossoms. There's a perky brown wren constructing a nest. And the tiny new apple leaves begin to suck in the warm spring air and sunshine. Warm green leaves gathering in warm sunshine. And if all of that change that we just witnessed from dormant and quiet to leafed out and flowering and humming and beautiful weren't enough of a transformation, the new spring green leaves are now performing absolute magic. They're capturing the energy of the sun in the sugars in their leaves, sugars that will soon become the sweetness of an apple. A scientist would call this photosynthesis. I would call it magic, because that sunshine on that apple tree will eventually become the sweetness of an apple. And so I invite you now to take a bite of your apple slice and fully appreciate that when you take a bite of apple, you take a bite of sunshine.
Oh, she's a preacher. I wish I had known that. I love her. Not many people there.
That's not the main church, though.
Oh, that's him.
Thank you so much for that, Barbara. Well, that was cute. It's always something. Okay. So, as you finish your apple slice, I have a question for you. Has anyone ever offered you a penny for your thoughts?
So it's going to be a miracle if this apple doesn't roll down the aisle. I keep losing it. So I've been very, very lucky in my life to spend my life pursuing a lifelong passion for science. Some of you know that I love gardening, but I also earned a PhD in oceanography. And I was lucky enough to spend more than 35 years as a marine research scientist down at the URI Bay campus. So my daughter will attest to the fact that I really am a science geek. Science just permeates my life. It permeates my thinking. Just give me the facts. Just give me the data. I love information. I love data. I'm one of those irritating people that stands and blocks the grocery store aisle while I read the label on the can and calculate, how many omega-3s I'm getting per serving. I'm constantly doing kitchen table science at home, all sorts of little curiosity experiments and things. I love facts and information. I was curious to know, for example, if it was the same box turtle that cruises through my garden every June, or whether there really are 20 different box turtles out there. So I actually, this is really embarrassing. I actually have a photo album of box turtles at home. And I can tell you that there really are 20 turtles out there. But there's one particular turtle that particularly likes my garden every June and is there every year. So I could go on and on about my science silliness, but I think more interesting for me now is how my science self managed is to coexist with my spiritual self. So how does my science self, who likes to find an orderly answer, an explanation for everything, make room for my spiritual self, who has lots of awe, but very few answers? And this is very, very much a work in progress for me right now. I asked you to do the meditation on the apple tree with me because it's a way for me to better articulate who I am spiritually right now. As a scientist, I could probably totally explain to you all about photosynthesis and how the leaves of the apple tree capture the energy from sunshine and sugars that end up in this apple. And I could write all the chemical equations for photosynthesis and talk about how the bees pollinate the flowers and how the flowers become apples. And I could describe and explain and continue to explain all the science behind this apple, but I would never actually really get totally to the magic that makes this apple happen. And even more amazing, how many of you, when you looked in your little thing here, you actually found an apple seed, okay? So how amazing is it that if you went home and planted that seed in your garden, you would actually grow a whole new apple tree? How amazing is it that all of the information needed to grow an entire apple tree is found in this little teeny tiny seed? The roots and the trunk and the branches and the leaves and the flowers, and even apples that can hold sunshine, all of that information resides in this tiny little seed. And that's where my spirituality lives. It's at that interface between the science that can drill down and explain all about photosynthesis and how the DNA in this seed can grow an entire apple tree, and the fact that I can learn and study and research all the science knowledge that there is, but I still won't fully be able to explain the miracle that is this tiny seed that can grow an entire tree, and this apple that connects me directly to the sun. My spirituality lives somewhere between the science and the magic that is the natural world. So this past summer, my spiritual beliefs became instantly more important to me when my doctor stunned me with a cancer diagnosis. Of course, my science self immediately wanted all the answers, give me the facts, give me the statistics, let me know what's going to happen here. But then my spiritual self began to wonder, wow, what's going to happen when I die? What will become of the me that is me when I die? I definitely feel the presence of miracles and maybe possibly a miracle maker in the natural world, but I'm not really sure that there's anything that comes after this for me. And that's actually a pretty scary thought. What's going to happen? So after giving it much thought and living it with it for a while and writing this reflection, I actually went home and ordered an apple tree to plant in my garden this spring, because I'm finding a great deal of comfort in knowing that if when I pass on, the essence of the me that is me just simply becomes one with the essence of that apple tree, I think that could be just fine. Thank you. Please rise now as you are willing and able for hymn number 350 in.
It seems to me that we should begin our first sermonic lesson on the principles by actually going over them. Now, they're printed in the front of each hymnal, both the gray and the teal. And we only have the gray one today anyway. But so as I read it, you might want to read along. And it starts like this. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. That's been off the whole time? Wow. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. A free and responsible search for truth and meaning. The right of conscience and the use of democratic process within our congregations and society at large. The goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. And there's also an eighth principle that's been in the works for a few years now, and it goes like this. Journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. While a lot of congregations like this one adopted that eighth principle early on, it's not yet been ratified by the whole body of the UUA. And sadly, it may never be. I've noticed that a lot of times the preamble is forgotten about as people read or refer to the principles. They just dive into the body of those principles, beginning with the inherent worth and dignity of every person. But that preamble is important because it spells out exactly what the principles are. A covenant made between congregations. It's a promise by and to congregations to commit ourselves to a set of values and to hold one another accountable to that commitment. That's why member congregations have to ratify the adoption of a new principle, and it's got to be a supermajority of congregations. It's kind of like the US Constitution. It's not easy to change, and it shouldn't be because it's a mutually agreed upon promise. So our principles are a covenant between congregations. They're not a creed, right? So nobody is expected to profess faith or belief in the principles in order to belong to a congregation or to our association. Now, if you want to adopt the principles as part of your own statement of faith, of course you can, but it's not required. So I feel like embarking on this project of unpacking the principles could be a really huge undertaking. We could take them one by one and exegete them, really break them down and analyze them in a process that Jews call midrash. We could start with looking at the context and the history of each principle, then define each word of each principle and see how each of those words has been used throughout Unitarian and Universalist history and in our association since the beginning of the UUA. We could read all of the sermons and essays that have ever been written about the principles and relate each to significant literature. We could take a month for each principle. We could take a year for each principle. But this is a congregation, not a seminary. And while I'm sure that some of us would love to go into that kind of depth, I'm afraid it would bore most people to tears or bore you all into absence. So we won't do that. What we're going to do is look at each principle through reflection on our personal experiences and observations about the world and our responsibility to the world. Sociologist Robert Bella's seminal sociological work on religion in America is called Habits of the Heart. It was first published, I think, in 1994. He and his team of researchers spoke with thousands of Americans about their personal experiences of religion, morality, and our shared national values. And Bella gave the keynote address at the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly in 1998. He talked about how in contemporary America, in that moment, and I would argue it's more true now, we idolize individualism on both sides of a political battle over opposing definitions of freedom. Robert Bella said that our seventh principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence, is a perfect foil or counterbalance to American individualism. And the individualism implied in our first principle, the worth and dignity of every person. He challenged us as an association to switch our first and seventh principles, making the interdependent web of all existence first and the worth and dignity of every person last. I gotta say, I kind of agree with him. So that's why I wanted to start with the seventh principle. And you know, I think Barbara did an amazing job explaining the seventh principle from her perspective. An apple as sunshine in a bite. It's a beautiful image, isn't it? Now, it's a perspective that's an awful lot like mine, actually. And talking about the seventh principle and really my whole theology, I've often used the imagery of a tree. And I talk about how a tree functions not as a collection of parts, but as a system that is part of a larger system. So a tree is not just a trunk and branches with bark and leaves. It's a process of growth that lives within a larger ecosystem, so that the soil and the tree and the animals that live in it and the microbes all need each other to thrive. They're all one system, one process, and we're part of that process in a system that extends way out to the edges of an ever-expanding universe. And I've also talked about how every molecule in our bodies was forged in the furnace of the sun and has existed since the Big Bang that created the universe. Each molecule within us has been part of other forms of being, both animate and inanimate, since the beginning of time. How amazing is that? We're all made up of the same stuff, and it's stuff that has existed forever. That means that each of us has existed in some way forever, and that you are me and I am you. And each of us has within us everyone who has ever lived and ever will live. And not just everyone, but everything. So that each one of us is sunshine in a package of flesh and bone and blood that will eventually return to the earth and the sun. And we're also darkness, and that's not negative. So that's the core of my theology, my understanding of what is of ultimate importance in our lives and in the life of the universe. If everything is part of everything else, then don't we, with our capacity for advanced thought and our capacity for action, have a responsibility to care for each other, to care for everything? That means that it's not just about protecting the earth. It's about caring for all existence, including ourselves, including people we don't know and never will know. Because everything is interconnected, everything is interdependent, everything is interrelated. So that's why I think it's important to know how our principles work as a system. Now, a lot of people have looked at our principles through a lot of different lenses and have come up with a lot of different metaphors. But here are two that work for me. Now, I've shared these in the past, but I'll share them again a bit more briefly, I hope. So the seventh principle is all about interconnectedness and our responsibility to everyone and everything on the planet, right? Now, you might call that a communitarian impulse. And the first principle, the inherent worth and dignity, is all about the individual. It's about autonomy, about freedom of existence and personal expression. You might call that one the libertarian impulse. So you can see how these two things would work against each other, right? Or push up against each other or pull apart, kind of like Congress. So I see the seven principles as a kind of rope. So the first and the seventh are pulling apart from each other, but the second through the sixth hold them together. They're kind of braided together, and they're the fibers that hold the first and the seventh in a dynamic tension that gives it its strength. The fibers of justice and compassion and peace, and spiritual growth, responsible learning, democracy, as messy as it is. When the libertarianism of the first principle threatens the existence of the whole, or when the communitarianism of the seventh threatens to become a stifling mob mentality, the second through the sixth principles hold us together. Now, if we add the eighth principle, that doesn't really work anymore, that image. So we need a new metaphor. And the one that I've used is still all about dynamic tension. Imagine a suspension bridge. You got the first and the seventh principles, and those are the towers that are in tension with one another. And the eighth principle, the commitment to dismantling racism, is the big cable that goes from one shore to the first tower to the second tower to the second shore. And they bear down on the tower so much that the towers are going to crash into each other. But the second through the sixth principles are those vertical cables in between that hold up the roadway, the journey toward wholeness, and keep the whole thing from falling apart. You need every part of the structure, the cables, the towers, the roadway, those verticals, to keep the whole thing together, to keep the structure to support the weight of the journey. You know, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "One day we must come to see that peace is not merely a distant goal that we seek, but a means by which we arrive at that goal. War," he said, "isn't the way to end tension. Practicing nonviolence, even when it's disrupted, and especially when it's difficult, is a tool to reach the goal of justice. Because justice is peace." So the things that are goals are actually also the tools to reach those goals. And that's how our principles work. Like that rope or that suspension bridge, the tension makes them stronger. Our seventh principle is all about interconnectedness, and so is the collection of our principles in our covenant. None can exist without the others, and each is not only the goal, but the means to achieving the goal. So I guess you could say that each principle is sunshine in a bite, made up of everything that came before it. And they'll survive into the future, even as they evolve over time. So in the next few months, I'll be talking more about the principles, individually, how they relate to each other, and how they're changing. Next week, Nancy Rose and I will be talking about the first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And on February 5th, I'll be talking about the one word that is glaringly missing from our principles: love. So stick around. Right now, though, let's all rise as we're willing and able and open our hymnals to number 203, All Creatures of the Earth and Sky.